Hi everyone! Today we are looking at Chapter 8, Lesson 8, Writing Fractions as Decimals. Students will be able to use fraction equivalence to write fractions as decimals. Recall that the word equivalent or equivalence means that they are fractions that name the same amount. They are equal to each other. All right, so for today's lesson, we are going to look at how to write a fraction as a decimal. So all fractions can be written as decimals, and all decimals can be turned into a fraction. We're going to start off with some simpler fractions, and we did this in a previous chapter, but then we're going to take it and look at some tougher examples. So let's first start off with the fraction 3/10. So think of 3/10. It means 3 out of 10. You can think of a model for 3/10, okay? And we can think of a grid for 3/10. So one of the models that I think of for 3/10 would be a model like this. Now, of course, this is not measured. It's not equal. It's just a rough drawing. So I have 10 equal bars, and I want to shade in 3 of those. 1, 2, 3. So that is showing me 3/10. Now I can take that and represent it as a decimal, which means we have to think back to our decimal place value. So in our decimal place value, we have the whole amount to the left of our decimal point, and then on the right, we have the parts. When we're talking about fractions, we are looking at the part that they are naming. So this 3/10 is not showing the entire whole amount, which means we have 0 wholes. We do have a part. We have 3/10. So our decimal place values that we're working on in 5th grade include the first 3 positions to the right of your decimal point. The first position is the 10ths place. The next one is the hundredths. And the third is the thousandths. Remember, third thousandths, 1, 2, 3 thousandths. So we're looking at tenths, 3/10, which means I need to place a 3 in the tenths position. That's the first spot to the right of your decimal point. So 3/10 looks like 0.3. A 3 in the 10ths place. What if I changed this and made it 7/10? That means I'm shading in some more. I have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Closer to being the whole, but not yet the whole. More than 1/2. And if I want to write that as a decimal, I need a 7 in the 10ths place. And there you have it, 0.7. We could also do the same thing if our denominator is 100. So if our denominator is 100, we could simply write that as a decimal. For example, if we have 12 100ths, that's 12 out of 100. If I draw a model, and again, this is going to be very rough. 1, 2. There's my tenths that I just had, but I want hundredths. So I'm going to then cut lines going across so that I have 10 going down. So 10 across. Ooh, that's off. 10 going down. 1, 2. And again, that's not measured out. They're obviously not equal pieces, and that's okay. Just doing this to give you a quick idea. So there's 100 little pieces. If I colored in 100 of them, I would represent 1 whole. But I don't have 100 of them. I have 12 out of 100. So if I count and shade in 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You can see I don't have very many I don't have a large part of the whole. I have 12 hundredths. To write this as a decimal, I need to use the hundredths position, which is the second number. I don't want to go beyond it because I only have hundredths. So I put my 12 in up to the hundredths. In other words, one whole column, which is a tenth, is shaded, and then I have two little extra pieces in the hundredths. Okay, so that's 12 hundredths. All right, so what we're really focusing on today is what happens when your denominator is not a 10 or a 100. And that's where we're using fraction equivalence to write fractions as decimals. So let's say we have 11 fiftieths. So I'm not going to draw a model for this, but I'm going to imagine 11 pieces out of 50. And then I want to say to myself, well, I need to make this a decimal. 11 out of 50 is definitely not a whole. So it's a 0 wholes, but I'm going to have some parts. Now, I will give you a heads up that if your denominator is not a 10 or 100, you can't just copy these numbers down into your decimal. You actually have to make a change. And that change is making an equivalent fraction. So we need to figure out 11 fiftieths, an equivalent fraction that has a decimal place value as the denominator. So what were those decimal place value words? Tenths, which would be a 10. Hundredths, which would be 100. Or even thousandths, which would be 1,000. Today we're focusing on 10 and 100. So I want to write here 10 or 100. And you have to pick which one works. When I do fraction equivalency, I'm multiplying or dividing the numerator and denominator by a number. Okay? So if I put a 10 here, that means I'm taking 50 and I'm dividing it by 5 to get 10. Well, if I do that to my numerator, which we learned in our last lesson, you have to, I would get a decimal or a fraction. So I'm not going to put a 10 as my denominator. But what I am thinking of is if I put 100, because remember, we're looking for the decimal place value words, tenths, hundredths. Aha, now I can easily make an equivalent fraction. Because I'm thinking, if I multiply 50 by something, I can get 100. What do I have to multiply 50 by to get 100? Aha, 50 times 2 gives me 100. And remember, what we do to the denominator, we then have to do the exact same thing to the numerator. That way, it keeps the fraction value the same. If I switch these two numbers, then I'm changing the value of that fraction. So I need to multiply my numerator by the same number. 11 times 2 gives me 22. And what I've done is made an equivalent fraction. 11 fiftieths is the same amount of space as 22 hundredths. They are equivalent. It's just this fraction here has a lot more pieces and they're smaller, but it shows the same amount of space. So now what? I've made a fraction that's equivalent with a denominator of 100. Well, 100 reminds me of the decimal place value hundredths. And that's the second position after my decimal point. First one is the tenths. So if I have 22 hundredths, I need to fit 22 up to the hundredths place. And I get 0.22, 22 hundredths. So here is the decimal that represents the fraction 11 fiftieths. Now, a common mistake would be for people to put 0.11. Well, that's not right, because 0.11 is 11 hundredths, but this says 11 fiftieths. Doesn't work. Let's try another one. Now let's take 3/5 and write that as a decimal. Remember, we're always trying to get decimal place value, tenths or hundredths. So I want to think of what I can multiply my denominator by to get to either 10 or 100, whatever one works. And I have to multiply it by a whole number. So I can do 5 times a whole number and get 10. 5 times 2 equals 10. And then I need to do the same thing to my numerator. I have to multiply that by 2 as well. And 3 times 2 equals 6. So 3/5 is equivalent to 6/10. And now that I have a denominator that's 10 or 100, I can write it as a decimal. It's 10 tenths. The first position after my decimal point is the tenths position, and I have 6/10. So our decimal equivalency is 0.6 or 6/10. Let's do one more example. Let's do 8/25. Okay, 8/25. Remember, we want to write it as a decimal. Imagine what this looks like. 8 out of 25. It's less than 1 whole, so I need my 0 point. And I want to have a denominator that is 10 or 100. 10 or 100. Well, 10 won't work. I would divide it by something, and I would not get 10. I would not have a whole number if I divided it by a whole. So let's try 100. It has to be 10 or 100 for what we're doing today. 25 times something does give me 100. 25 times a whole number, 4, gives me 100. So I have to do that to our numerator and multiply it by 4. Got to keep it the same. 8 times 4 equals 32. So 8/25 is equivalent to 32 hundredths. And to write that as a decimal, I have hundredths. The first spot is my tenths. The second is the hundredths. And how many hundredths do I have? I have 32 hundredths. So 8/25 is equivalent to 0.32 or 0 and 32 hundredths. Okay. All right. So hopefully you found this video helpful. We will continue to look at fractions throughout a bunch of other chapters, and we will continue to work on these skills. But that's it for today. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks for watching.